Hi everyone, welcome to the Toronto Data Workshop. This week we're joined by Silvia Canelón, who's a postdoc researcher at Department of Biostats, Epidemiology and Informatics at Penn. So she's really interested in electronic health records and has spent her professional life bringing order to the chaos that is electronic health records, and here to tell us a little bit about it. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay, we can just hop right in. Okay, let me share a link to the slides for today. Share that in the chat box. And let's see if I can get this. Okay, let's try sharing. Okay, and then could I get verbal confirmation from someone that you can see my slides?
Yeah, I can see them. It's perfect.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I titled the talk today, Lessons Learned from the EHR, because I've been working with EHR data throughout my postdoc, and I hadn't worked with EHR data before. And so there's just interesting things that you might encounter when you're working with EHR data. So this is kind of just meant to showcase some of these interesting things that I came across. And then also I'm hoping that it might excite some people in the room to maybe work with EHR data if they're feeling a little bit hesitant or like unsure what that means. Okay, so about me, I'm a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. And I work, my PI is Mary Regina Boland, and we work on leveraging electronic health record data to study pregnancy-related outcomes. And so the lab in general does work with population health and in the context of reproductive health, mainly. And so I consider myself a biomedical informaticist or informatician. And I like this definition from the Oregon Health and Science University, which says that it's the field that's concerned with the optimal use of information, often aided by the use of technology to improve individual health, healthcare, public health, and biomedical research. And so before I move forward, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how it is that I got here to working with this kind of data. And as I mentioned, when I started this postdoc back in 2018, I hadn't worked with EHR data before. And before that, when I did my PhD work at Purdue University in Indiana, it was very different. I was doing cell culture work. So I was, working with cells in a hood and working with really small data sets, this data that I would personally collect and then analyze. And it was also very far removed from any kind of clinical context. It was basic research, so it was just very far removed, and I was feeling like I wanted to move more in the direction of something that seemed a little bit more tangible or more applicable to like people's day-to-day lives. And so I had started looking into informatics, and then I had found out that my current PI did work in reproductive health with EHR data, and I was thinking that it would be a really interesting transition. And so that's sort of how I ended up where I am today. And so that's all to say that whatever I'm presenting today and the things that I've learned have happened in the past few years. So I'm by no means an expert, but I'm an expert at what I've done. and it's just been kind of messy and a wild ride. Okay, so our journey together today, we're just going to cover a few different things. We're just talk generally about EHR data. We're going to talk a little bit about data mining in the context of my work. We're going to talk about data mysteries, which is the most fun part of today's talk, I think. And we're going to end with data privacy as well. Okay, so just going into EHR data. So what I have on the slide here is I'm starting with structured data. So there's different types of data that are contained within an EHR record. And I work primarily, or actually at the moment, exclusively with structured data. And what that means is that it's data that's stored there's different columns, and if I'm thinking about like a relational database, there's different columns, different variables, and they each contain, it's like a placeholder where a care provider would input information about a patient's encounter in the medical system. And so the right-hand side shows an example of what this input process can look like from the point of view of a care provider at Penn Medicine. And so what I would highlight here, for example, is that there's a section called clinical impression, where in this case, the clinical care provider has typed preeclampsia into the search box. And then on the back end, there's, I guess there's sort of logic-based algorithms, maybe more complex algorithms that then find different kind of problems that could be related to preeclampsia, and then the care provider might then choose one of those to then assign to the patient. So it's sort of keeping track of the problems that the patient presents with so that it's all recorded in their medical record or their electronic health record. And so that way, when a patient moves from provider to provider or from hospital to hospital, all their information is saved in this record. And so the kind of things that you would find that already have like a placeholder when the care provider goes to input information about a patient's visit are things like a description of the problem, billing codes. So in the US, we have different insurance companies, and there's certain reimbursement processes that happen depending on what kind of problem the patient is being seen for. They may or may not have something covered by their insurance. And so billing codes are the way that these things sort of get cataloged, and those are the things that then an insurance company would look at and see and decide whether or not someone's going to get coverage for something that they went into the clinic to get care for. Other things you would see in there are important dates. So when did the patient show up? When were they discharged? Those sorts of things are really important. Medications, of course, allergies. And then whenever a patient encounters the medical system, the day that they encounter the medical system, there's also a bunch of demographic information that's collected, including age, race and ethnicity, address, religion, just a bunch of different things that we also can have access to. And then there's another type of data that is very, actually, before I move there, there's an image here on the slide of a different layout of what the front end of a medical record input might look like from the point of view of a provider. So this is just a mock entries for a patient called Mickey Mouse. And so in the center of the slide, there's a little panel that says problems. And so we see here that Mickey Mouse, it has neck pain, and that's associated with specific ICD-9 or ICD-10 codes. Those are those billing codes that I mentioned. And then onset of the neck pain, for example, is also included in there, the date of onset. And then Mickey Mouse also has knee pain. And so this is an example of what it could look like. Now, a little bit more about ICD-9 and 10. So these are, ICD stands for International Classification of Diseases, and it's a very widely used system for coding different kind of clinical conditions. And the World Health Organization sort of has an international standard, and then there's countries will adapt those standards, and they might tweak them a little bit according to what they might need to track in their particular region. And so ICD-9 codes were, actually don't remember when they were implemented, when they were first implemented, but they comprise like a set of codes for all these different conditions. And then in 2015, I believed, everybody was to switch to ICD-10, which is like an expanded version of the ICD-9, and there's a ton more codes in ICD-10 than 9. And so I'm just throwing out an example here, but in ICD-9, you might have a code that says well, let's just take neck pain, Mickey Mouse's neck pain. So maybe the code is neck pain, but maybe there's an even more specific code in ICD-10 that says neck pain due to something, something, something. And so it might be specific based on location of the body or cause. There's just a lot of different ways that you could encounter really specific codes for ICD-10. Okay, and then there's also unstructured data. So that is mainly clinical notes. So when you encounter a care provider, they might write some notes about you and your visit. And so that's just a way for them to provide more context to your visit than what they can provide in those sort of placeholder spots for the different things like problems and codes and allergies, et cetera. And so if you're analyzing unstructured data, you're probably using natural language processing techniques. And the kind of text that you would encounter is not standardized. Some things might be common from one provider to another, the way that they write things down, but it's really not standardized. You can find a lot of different things tucked away in the clinical notes. They can contain abbreviations that provider uses or that specific department in the hospital uses that maybe doesn't apply anywhere else. You'll definitely find typos because people entering this are human. And you can also find stigmatizing language written in the clinical notes by the care providers, which is unfortunate. And of course, this reflects a provider bias. And so I linked to a study at the bottom of the slide that talks about the kind of racial bias you might find in electronic health records. And this was, I think, a study conducted in Chicago, Illinois in the US. And so they found that the most common descriptors included things like, in the context of describing a patient would be like words like refused, not compliant, agitated, and where's I going with this? Yeah, so it just sort of points to the fact that not all providers use patient-centered language when they're writing notes about the patients that they're seeing and caring for. Okay, and then here, oh, it's not showing the formatted version. Okay, let's open up. I have a tweet that I wanted to show you, but maybe we'll just open it up in the actual browser. Let's see. Nope, that's not the right link. Oh, I can't. Okay, hold on. Give me 1 second. I want to show it to you because it's from somebody that a lot of people here would know. Unless someone has a direct link, if they're able to access it when they're looking at the slides. For some reason, it didn't format correctly, so I'm just going to search for it. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is a tweet that I have permission to share from Mina Chetinkaya-Rundell. And so she tweeted back in December, "Today I saw a new dermatologist after months of waiting for an appointment. I had hoped for a productive visit, but we ended up pissing off each other. Doctor," in this context, doctor says, "You can get a bougie face wash at Ulta for $50 if you want, but it won't work." And then Mina says, "Oh, I wonder what I said that this is in my visit notes." So this is an example of what the provider, in this case, a dermatologist, wrote in the notes. And so it says here, "No other skin complaints today. She works as a statistician." And so this is a funny example, right? But it also shows, I mean, in the context of the tweet and the way that she described it, she described it as, "We ended up pissing off each other." So I think we can sort of guess that maybe the comment about them being a statistician maybe wasn't super positive, or maybe that there was some underlying something about the comment. And so that's a kind of a mild example of how providers' attitudes towards a patient might show up in the clinical notes. Okay, so let's move on to data mining and look at some examples. So the reason we might need to mine data from the EHR is that the data that we're interested in isn't always readily available. So even though there's structured data where everything's laid out in a pretty straightforward way, and then there's clinical notes if you want to go the unstructured data route, you still may not have access to the things that you're particularly interested in researching to answer the questions that you have. Data may be unlinked or incomplete or inaccurate or dense. There also just might be a ton of data to wade through to try to answer your question. And so sometimes we need to develop data mining algorithms to get the information that we need. So in this example, let me go back to full screen mode. So as I mentioned, in the lab that I work in, we look at pregnancy-related outcomes. And so one of my first projects when I started this job was trying to figure out how to even identify which patients in the medical record had delivered within the hospital system, because it wasn't very straightforward. And initially I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll just find all the codes, all the ICD codes that are related to a delivery, and then I'll find the patients that were assigned those codes, and then I'll have the dates they delivered, and it'll be great. And what I found out was that patients aren't assigned one delivery code on one date. For whatever reason, they might be assigned multiple different delivery codes over multiple days. And so how do we pick which day was the actual delivery day? So you have to start thinking about how to answer these questions. And so the diagram on the screen here shows an example of someone who has 2 pregnancies in their timeline. So one pregnancy that results in a delivered baby, and then a second pregnancy sometime later that results also in another delivery. And so there are these little yellow diamonds kind of clustered around the delivery date, and those are the delivery codes that might have been assigned. So some of them are assigned right on the date that the baby was born, and then other ones are assigned at other days. And so what my project had to do, or what I ended up having to do, was designing some kind of logic-based algorithm where we could identify these clusters of delivery codes for each patient, and then be able to distinguish one from the other. And we worked with clinicians that could provide context for example, we were advised that, well, if the clusters are at least 180 days apart, then you can assume they're separate pregnancies. You know, they wouldn't be related to the same pregnancy. And so that's sort of how we came up with, like, okay, this cluster is going to be separate from this cluster if the separation between the clusters is greater than 180 days. And so the reason why this is important for us is because it lends additional granularity to the data that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So before doing something like this, we would have been able to say, okay, these patients had deliveries, but like maybe over this period of time, but we wouldn't have been able to say this particular patient had this particular delivery. And so what, I think the next slide has a diagram also. Yeah, so the right-hand side shows a schematic of the algorithm that I put together. And we're not going to go through all the steps, but this is just to highlight how there's several different decisions that sort of get made as you move through this schematic. And I ended up starting off with records from over 1 million female patients. And that's another thing, is in the medical records, patients are only categorized as either male or female. So there's a limitation in how this data gets collected. But in our case, we had over 1 million female patients, all with records in the medical system over a 7-year period of time. And then by the end of this, of applying this algorithm, then we were able to identify about 50,560 patients that had delivered, and some of them delivered more than once. And so we had a total of 63,300 or so distinct deliveries. And then we were able to validate that with a small data set that was available for within the maternal and fetal medicine department at the hospital. So sometimes some hospital systems will automatically link data from a parent who delivered to the child that was delivered. And so when that happens, you have the exact date of the delivery. But at Penn, they don't do that. At Penn, they don't make that linkage automatically. I believe for privacy reasons, it's just an added layer of separation. And so we just have to come up with creative ways to find that information ourselves. Okay, so then what that means is that if we have the clusters of deliveries, then when we identify other things that might be happening, we can link them to a specific delivery. And so if we find, for example, stillbirth, we're interested in investigating stillbirth in certain patient populations. Now, because we know that period of time when somebody delivered, if we find a stillbirth code within those clusters, which in this diagram is a red diamond, then we can link that particular outcome to that particular pregnancy. Okay, so moving on to data mysteries. So I have two mysteries that I'm hoping we can work through together. I'm going to see if I can open up the chat box and see what people have to say. Okay, now these mysteries have been solved, but I won't give you the answer until we talk about it. Okay, so let's solve some data mysteries together. Case number one, this is what we know, is I'm at my computer and I open up my IDE and I import some ICD codes from an external spreadsheet. So there's a spreadsheet in particular that has a list of curated codes that I'm interested in, and I'm going to use those codes to then subset a patient population. And so I import this spreadsheet, and then I think, okay, great. Now I'm going to look at my large data set of all the patient records, and I want to find all the patients that have a code from that curated shorter list that I have that I just imported. And so I should be left with patients in this particular example that have fallopian tube procedures, but they're missing. I don't have them. I try to, after I link them up, after I link my records to the codes that I imported and I try to subset, I don't have them. And so I have two codes in the slide. And so some of you may have seen the answer already, but this is just one example where there's a code to give you a sense for what they look like. There's a code that is 66, and the description for that code would be operations on fallopian tubes. And the function that this code has is that it's just a broad category of codes. And then there's 66.0, which is a very specific kind of fallopian tube operation. And so it's a very specific code. So we've talked about how the ICD codes try to be really, really specific as much as possible. Yeah, so then my question for the group would be, what you think might have happened in the different steps. So if I'm pulling in these codes and I'm trying to identify the patients that have one of those codes, but for whatever reason they're not there, and I know that some of the codes look like 66, and I know some of the codes look like 66.0. I guess I'm having a hard time even articulating a question for the group, but I'll just pose a question. If anybody, like if you were in my shoes, what would you think to do next? And the clue here, I guess, would be spreadsheets. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. So the culprit was that Excel had cut off the trailing zeros from all the codes in my spreadsheet. And so then when I imported them, I only had, all of them were showing up as 66, for example. And because this is a broad category of codes, it wouldn't actually be assigned during a visit because it's just a category. And so none of the records that I had, which are very specific to a particular visit, would have been showing up, because the ones that we were looking for were the ones that ended in a 0, and the spreadsheet had cut off the zeros, and that column wasn't saved with the right format. Okay, I see reader importing. Yeah, so the guess is, one of the guesses is I could also see reader importing as numeric and then treating 66 and 66.0 the same, but it wouldn't if it imported as character. Yeah, so that's exactly it, is when these codes were saved in the spreadsheet, they were saved as some kind of either the generic variable type or a numeric variable type. And so then when I imported them, then there were no more trailing zeros. And the frustrating, or maybe tedious is a better word, the tedious aspect of this mystery was that this curated set of ICD codes was actually not that small. There were like tons of codes in there, and they had been curated by somebody else in our lab, and they had painstakingly gone through and curated this list. And yeah, I just hadn't saved it as a character type. And so then one of my fun projects then had to be to go through and try to identify, okay, which of these codes are 66s and which ones are supposed to be 66.0. And luckily there's and I use R, and so there's an R package, I think it's called ICD codes, that I used that was really helpful, because it could help me identify the codes that were those like broader categories, and then which ones were the ones that live under those categories. Anyways, okay, next mystery. And there's just two. So this is an example. I'm trying to move all these things on my screen. Okay, so this is just an example, because the one I'm going to show you next is the actual mystery, but to give you a sense of what one might expect to look at. This is like a line graph and area graph, but there's a line graph showing the rates of hemorrhage over time within the hospital system. So from 2010 to 2017, it's broken up by seasons, and at every season there's a hemorrhage rate, and so that's plotted over time. And so we kind of see that there's a little bit of fluctuation over time. There's kind of a peak in the 2012 year. We're not entirely sure what that is, but overall we see that there's sort of ups and downs for the entire period. And so the next one is the confusing one. So this is a very similar graph, but instead of hemorrhage, we're looking at blood transfusion rates over time. And we see that there's this super steep drop off in October to December of 2015. And so then the question is, what happened in that period of time? So the other example was a fake example, but this one was something that I was looking at and was very confused about. And so if it were you, what would you guess might be happening in that period of time? Okay, so someone here says, check the time axis, 2016 to 2017 should read 2020 to 2021. Okay, so if I'm understanding that correctly, it could be that the data I'm looking at is recent, and so there maybe not enough data has been collected, and so maybe there's missing data in that sense, and I wasn't looking closely enough at the way that I was labeling the data. Okay, another question is, or suggestion is, did the ICD code change in 9 to 10? So do you mean from ICD 9 to ICD 10? Yeah, so that is very close to what happened. So there was a change in ICD coding practices. And this was, where did I start with this? This was, okay, before I say that, okay, never mind. Okay, yeah, so what happened in this situation was that, as I mentioned, there was a switch from ICD-9 to ICD-10 in 2015. And I also mentioned that ICD-10 is a lot more specific than ICD-9. So there's tons and tons more codes in ICD-10 than 9. And so what happened was that there's a group that noticed a trend in the hospital system where providers were not they sort of had foregone coding blood transfusions altogether because there were so many options and it was complicated to code. And so they stopped using ICD-10 codes to code for blood transfusions and instead were indicating blood transfusions some other way, using kind of like a different coding system or in the notes or something like that. And so on our end, because we were using ICD-10 codes, we see this drop off and we wouldn't know what happened, right? So you have to search. Sometimes you just have to dig around. And so I think in this case, the resource that I linked on the slide was it was kind of like a guidance document that was shared to provide guidance for staff that was coding for blood transfusions because they had noticed that there had been this pattern. And I only would have known about that because I was already looking at some of the other documents that group was sharing. Anyways, but that's a kind of interesting thing that you might find when you're working with this kind of data is like all data collection, you really have to think about how the human on the other side, right? On my side, I only ever analyze the data, I don't collect it. And so that's why it's really important to have collaborators and advisors that have that experience collecting the data so that you can find out what these weird things are. Again, because everybody collecting data is human and they do human things, which are really difficult to predict. And so you always have to ask questions and not make any assumptions about what you're seeing. Okay, so the last chunk here that I wanted to just go through real quick is data privacy. So it may not surprise anybody in this group that because this is really sensitive information, it's subject to very strict protections. And so, for example, in our lab, we don't just get to ask for whatever data we want from whatever patients we want at the hospital. We have to submit a very specific request. It has to get approved by a board that reviews the study for ethics. And we have to know exactly what we're asking for. So even if we know the patient populations that maybe we're interested in, we also have to know what variables to ask for because the group that is going to pull the data and then share it with us securely isn't going to give us all the variables collected for all time for those patients. So we have to know exactly what to ask for. And yeah, which makes sense. And so some of the things that I've learned in addition to that is that mental health data is protected. And so I think you have to be, I think there's just several other, I think, requirements that you might have to meet as somebody who wants to do research using EHR data that contains mental health data in order to have it approved. It's not just readily available. Children's data is also protected. And we kind of talked a little bit about how in my particular case, it mattered a lot because it means that I can't link children's data with parental data and then figure out when a child was born from that particular parent. And then sometimes we are able to analyze data that and like summarize it, right? Sometimes people try anonymizing the data and to a point where it meets some kind of privacy standard, but more and more we're becoming aware that it's not enough because there are ways to re-identify people. And so I've linked to a piece here from MIT Technology Review about how this can happen. And so there's just other privacy standards that I think will need to get implemented moving forward. And then the last thing I say here too that I also learned about recently is that HIPAA protections do not necessarily apply to law enforcement. So this was really surprising to me. I learned about this, I don't remember exactly where it was, one of these webinars last year, and they were sharing that in some cases when a patient is admitted to the emergency room in the US, if the way that they were admitted or the situation in which they were admitted is related to some kind of in some kind of perhaps criminal context and there's law enforcement involved, they sometimes ask for information that they don't have explicit permission to have, and so it can be a really tricky area to navigate, both as a person that's working, for example, in the ER, who is approached to be asked for this information by somebody in law enforcement, and also sort of, I think, a lack of education or awareness on the side of law enforcement to know that that is not information that should be asked for. So anyway, so I found that pretty interesting. And then this last one that I have is that I also learned that if someone wants to study opioid use disorder or opioid prescription patterns, some of which can be documented in the clinical notes, so that unstructured data that I talked about before, that sometimes before the researchers even receive it, it can get scrubbed. And the idea is that perhaps for political reasons, perhaps the institution, there's something there, there's some friction there between maybe the hospital system or the institution that has this data and their willingness to sort of share that freely with researchers that are studying things that are maybe contentious. Okay, and so then to close up, I put here, if you're interested in learning more about EHR data, there was another talk from the Toronto Data Workshop last year that I linked here that I found very interesting. And that one was specifically about algorithmic fairness, if I recall, in the context of electronic health records. And thank you. And I listed here information about where you can find me. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Silvia. That was just wonderful. I can feel your pain on every slide, so I appreciate you sharing your experience so that we can hopefully avoid some of those. I'll just ask one question, which is the traditional one, and then I'll stop recording. And so, do you have any books that you recommend for folks?
Yes, I have a short list of books. Let me link to them in the slides or in the chat box. One of my favorite recent ones is called How We Show Up. And this is a book that, there's a link, that talks a lot about how different people create their communities and their families and what those connections look like in a lot of different contexts. And so it just provides a really nice kind of overview of yeah, like what connection and community can look like outside of sort of the conventional structures. And another one that I'm in the middle of right now that I've been meaning to read for a very long time, but I'm finally getting around to, is Race After Technology, which I bet would be of interest to a lot of people here if they haven't already read it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. So I'll just stop recording.